So go ahead and get started. Thanks again for everyone who's joining us tonight for today's speaker series event, Slanted, How an Asian American Troublemaker Took on the Supreme Court, with rock stars Joe X Jiang and Simon Tam. I think they're both the first rock stars we've hosted as part of this series. So that's a really nice way to mix things up. Tonight is a recorded event that will be another entry of the First Amendment Museum's online speaker series. If this is your first time attending one of our free presentations, the First Amendment Museum is a nonpartisan nonprofit located in Augusta, Maine. I'm Max Nospish, the Manager of Education and Visitor Experiences here at the First Amendment Museum. Sorry, I'm just letting a couple more people in. We rely on gifts from viewers like you to continue the work we do. So if you enjoy this presentation, please consider donating to us. I'll put that, or one of my staff members will maybe, put that link in the chat. Also check out our website and YouTube channel for future and past speaker series installments and other events such as film screenings and blog posts and other great content, virtual exhibits, all sorts of stuff. Like I said, tonight we have two awesome guests. We're again rock stars, mixing it up. Simon Tam and Joe X Jiang. Simon Tam is an author, musician, activist, and self-proclaimed troublemaker, which I think is another first we've had here at the First Amendment Museum, a self-proclaimed troublemaker. So welcome, Simon. Best known as the founder and bassist of the band The Slants, the world's first and only all-Asian American dance rock band. Simon approaches arts and activism with radical optimism and compassion. In 2017, he won a landmark case at the U.S. Supreme Court, unanimously, helping to expand civil liberties for marginalized groups, which we're going to hear all about tonight. His work has been highlighted in over 3,000 media features across over 150 countries, including Rolling Stone, Time, NPR, the BBC, the New York Times, and more. Joe X Jiang is a filmmaker and musician who has called Portland, Oregon, not Maine, where I currently am, home for over a decade. His movies, which range from intimate documentaries to artistic narratives, have been featured at film and art festivals around the world. His most recent project, The Cutting Shadow, was screened at the 2017 San Diego Asian Film Festival and showcased at multiple more festivals in 2018. As a musician, Joe performs in several bands, including the Slants, and is also a producer. I should also mention that tonight is extra special because the First Amendment Museum actually has an entire exhibit now on display on site at the museum about what you're going to hear all about tonight. It's up on display as we speak. So if you're ever in Augusta, Maine, if you're ever taking a trip to the Northeast, stop by and see us. We're going to be hosting an official exhibit opening this May. So check out our website for more on that. If you have questions for Joe and Simon, please drop those questions in the chat throughout our presentation tonight. If you're in the watching on Facebook, please drop those comments in the comment section. We will do a Q&A after the presentation where we'll be reading your questions and more. So I'm going to hand it over to Joe and Simon. Thank you guys for joining us.
Hey, thank you so much for having us tonight. I'm Simon. On guitar and vocals is Joe, and this is my story.
I woke up from a tear-filled dream, a distant vision of a world without sorrow that seems so out of reach. And just when I think that all hope would fade, she takes my hand and says it's worth the wait. The path is built by the brave. Bring on the comets, rain them down up from the stars. Light up the night sky, sing until the dawn is ours. My will's what defines me, my failures remind me. My vow is to never live in fear. A song and a story, a memoir of glory. The future is here, and the band plays on, even when hope is gone. were my favorite song, and the band plays on, even when hope is gone. You were my favorite song, and the band plays on, even when hope is gone.
2011, our band was invited to play at the Oregon State Penitentiary. It's the maximum security prison in Oregon. Now, as a Johnny Cash fan, I was super excited about this. I mean, I was even planning on wearing all black that day. But it never really occurred to me that the idea of sending an all-Asian band into a prison with one of the highest populations of neo-Nazis in the country might be particularly dangerous. Didn't occur to me until we were actually going through our second set of metal detectors. You see, it was at that point that they took all of our IDs away from us. They searched us and they sent us through these metal detectors. And that's also when we were given these bright orange jerseys with these big numbers on them, like we were going to play flag football or something. That's what we were supposed to wear for the day, making us look more like kids in a junior high PE class than a rock and roll band. But at this point, the singer in my band asked the guard, hey, we wear suits and vests and things when we play, and it's really hot out there. Is it okay if we remove the jerseys when we're on the stage? And the guard looks at us and he says, sure, but if something happens out there, those things let us know who not to shoot. So of course I'm like, can I get 2 of them vests? As we make our way through the prison, I started to realize how little we actually knew about the system or the people behind bars in that system. Like everything I knew came from books, TV shows, and movies, and they didn't exactly have very good things to say about the incarcerated. I mean, this is years before Orange is the New Black was on television, and I wasn't really thinking about the prison industrial complex and how it might uphold white supremacy. I just thought it's a maximum security prison. That means it must be the worst of the worst, right? Drug dealers, rapists, murderers, and so on. Well, finally, we make our way through the prison and we arrive at what they like to call the big yard. Now, the big yard was this outdoor space a little bit larger than a football field. It was surrounded by these huge, thick concrete walls of these sentry towers that had searchlights and mounts for weapons. At the end of the big yard was a small stage, and that's where we were supposed to play that day. But of course, I astutely noted that the only thing that was going to be separating our band from about 2,000 inmates was only a small collection of orange safety cones and a very thin piece of plastic tape that said, "Police, do not cross." And so, of course, I turned to the guard and I said, hey, I don't know if they follow these kinds of instructions. I mean, that's why they're here, right? Like they literally can't follow society's rules. But of course, the guard's like, oh, no, don't worry. We have a plan. And of course, I'm like, well, what is it? And he says, well, if something happens out there, like a fight breaks out, you're in danger, we just need you to drop everything and run behind you toward that large chain link fence behind the stage. We'll be on the other side. So when you're through, that's when we can secure it. So I'm like, let me get this straight. If something happens, like if our lives are in danger, your plan is for us to just drop everything and run? Like you'll be on the safe side. And if we make it through in time, that's when you're going to lock it down. And he's like, well, I wouldn't say it like that exactly, but yeah. I'm like, where did you get the plan from? The Walking Dead? I mean, I feel like they had a better plan than this. I thought this was the government, an institution full of best practices designed to protect its people, that they have the experience and the wisdom to handle these sorts of things. But it doesn't really matter because eventually we take the stage. And for us as artists, as musicians, there's something magical that happens when we have a chance to share that which we are most passionate about with other people, our music. We're not thinking about criminal status. We're just sharing something that is deeply meaningful to us. I'll never forget as I watched this small crowd that was gathered in front started to grow. And when we launched into our cover, Painted Black by the Rolling Stones, this crowd began to jump up and down to the music.
I see a red door and I want it painted black. No colors anymore, I want it to turn black. I see the girls walk by dressed in their summer clothes. I have to turn my head until my darkness goes.
Now, at the end of the show, I'm standing over there by that police station, you know, on the safe side, of course. And I see this small group of very, very large white men start approaching me. They're covered head to toe in tattoos. And as they get closer, I notice that the man in front has 2 words carved into his chest: white power. Those feelings of anxiety begin bubbling up inside of me again. He's getting closer and closer, and he looks a bit anxious himself. Now he's about an arm's length away when he reaches out to me, and he hands me a piece of paper and a very sharp pencil. I'm frozen. Like, the only thing going through my mind is that scene in Jurassic Park where they're like, if you don't move, the T-Rex can't see you. But obviously it's too late. He already saw me. But then he says those 4 words that just cuts right through me. It's for my daughter. And he says, will you please sign it?
His skin was stained with stories of pain, but he wanted to change. Will you let him? Can you believe? He's asked for forgiveness in his daughter's name. Can you forget him? Do people live forever, imprisoned by a state? Nothing could be done to earn a little grace. Did you think we couldn't get this far? This is who we are, this is who we are. And did you think we couldn't get this far? This is who we are, this is who we are.
So we just have this short exchange, and it's mostly me asking him questions like, what grade is your daughter in? And avoiding questions like, so why are you in here? Because it seemed kind of obvious, like, you know, he couldn't follow the instructions, so to speak. But as we're talking, he says to me, I can't change what's stained into my skin, but I could change what's in here, in my heart, and I could change what's in here. He told me that he made a lot of mistakes in his life, and they were ones that he didn't want his little girl to make. And it was probably one of the most powerful most powerful experiences I ever had as a musician, because, you know, when we walked into that prison, we were full of assumptions. And I'm pretty sure that when this guy and his friends saw a group of Asian people taking the stage, that they probably had their own assumptions as well. I mean, technically, I was literally judging him by his skin, but, you know, granted, it said white power up in there. But once we actually had a chance to engage, to see the humanity in each other, we both walked away changed that day. And I started the Slants in 2006 because I wanted to change people's assumptions about Asian Americans. You see, I grew up in San Diego, California in the 1980s. And back then, we didn't have any kind of social mirrors or representation in the media. I mean, this is decades before Crazy Rich Asians, Always Be My Maybe, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once were killing it in theaters and on TV screens. Look, all we had were white actors like Mickey Rooney taping his eyes back and making mock Japanese accents, or these overt stereotypical characters like Long Duck Dong and 16 Candles. And I think this lack of nuance contributed to me being bullied as a kid. And I was attacked multiple times. There's this one incident in 7th grade that always jumps out at me. You see, back then, different students would take turns staying back to clean up the PE yard while everyone else would go hit the showers. Now, on this particular day, I thought it was my turn. It was my turn. I thought I was alone out there as it was my turn, picking up the volleyball nets, basketballs, and other sports equipment. But then I could feel myself being shoved to the ground. Now, as I look up, I see there's 4 guys standing over me. But the thing that actually terrifies me the most is this grin that they all have. You know, like they're enjoying the moment, savoring it. And that's when it begins, just over and over and over again. They began kicking me in the stomach, throwing sand in my eyes, hitting me in the face, all while yelling 2 words again and again: Jap and Gook. I was terrified. I didn't really know how to respond until at some point, something in me just snaps. I look at them and I said, I'm a chink. Like, that's how stupid you are. You can't even be a racist properly. They were so surprised by this that they stopped and they walked away. You see, I believe there's power in claiming an identity. There is power in saying, you don't get to define me. Only I get to do that. And I think some part of this lesson carried over when I entered in high school. You see, high school is where I met my friend Kyle. And of course, that's when I fell in love with the Ramones.
Well, I don't care about history. Rock, rock, rock and roll high school, 'cause that's not where I wanna be. Rock, rock, rock and roll high school. I just wanna have some kicks. I just wanna get some chicks. Rock, 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 rock and roll high school.
Now, this was way before Hot Topic hit the mall near us. So the idea of me having this homemade wallet chain out of safety pins, like, nobody thought this thing was cool. Nobody except for Kyle. Now, one day Kyle shows up and he's got hot pink hair spiked into Liberty spikes all over his head. And I was like, Kyle, you look so cool. You're so punk. Well, nobody else at the school felt that way. I mean, all day long, you could hear people laughing. You could see them pointing their fingers. You could see teachers giving him these dirty looks. Now, I was supposed to meet Kyle after school on this day, but I was running a little bit behind. By the time I got there, a very familiar scene was unfolding before me. Kyle, now surrounded by a dozen guys, they were pushing him around and saying horrible things. Things like, what are you, some kind of faggot? You queer or something? At one point, one of them says, how come your mom lets you walk out the door looking like that? So I jump in and I'm like, hey, maybe it's because his mom's not stupid and ignorant like you. No, maybe she doesn't judge people by what's on the outside, but by what's on the inside, because that's what counts. Now, I thought this is an excellent answer. I mean, I thought this is literally true, but they didn't feel that way. Instead, they turned their attention towards me, started pushing me around. They called me Jackie over and over again. They said, Jackie, what's wrong, Jackie? What are you going to do, Jackie? And of course, I'm like, yo, I'm in classes with a couple of you guys. You know, my name's not Jackie. But that's when one of them says it, Jackie Chan. And all I could think of at the time was like, I'm not Jackie Chan. I mean, the man is significantly older than me. He's got this bulbous nose that's been busted from doing all those stunts. But more importantly, Jackie knows something that I don't. Martial arts. Like, he could school all these guys in a minute. I took 1 week at karate camp with my cousins in 5th grade, and they only gave me this white belt with this yellow sticker on it out of pity. I didn't think it was going to help me out here, but I did think back on that 7th grade day, and I was like, oh, maybe. So I struck the one karate pose that I could remember, and they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Hey, we're just messing with you. Simon, right? Yeah, we're in classes with you. We're just messing around. It was the second time that claiming a stereotype actually helped me out in some kind of way. Now, I wish I could say all my experiences in high school and junior high ended up this way with bravery and wit, but the reality is that it almost always ended the same way, with me running away, trying to find a place to hide, and crying because I didn't want to get hit again. In 11th grade, I walked up to my dad. I said, Dad, I'm ashamed of being Chinese. And I just broke my parents' heart, but I was tired of getting killed out there. Fast forward a few years later, and I'm just a couple of months away from graduating at UC Riverside on a double major, on a full ride scholarship. But that's when I have this brilliant idea of dropping out of college and moving across the country so that I could join a punk rock band. Now, nobody told me before I moved to Portland, Oregon, that it actually has a nickname. You see, people like to call it America's whitest major city. And there in America's whitest major city, I started missing a little bit of my culture, hearing my first languages, seeing people who look like me. And so in that state of loneliness, I would import all these movies from eBay, like VHS tapes shipped from Hong Kong, and involved, of course, a lot of movies with Jackie Chan, because let's face it, he is a straight up badass. But during this time, some of my friends are like, hey, you like all those action movies. Have you ever seen Kill Bill? I missed it while it was in the theaters that day, but I did buy it the day it came out on DVD. So now it's April 2004, and I'll never forget watching this bright yellow disc of these 3 black lines sliding into that player. And as the movie begins, there's plenty of witty banter and action, but there's this one particular scene that really jumped out at me. A woman named Oren Ishii begins to walk into this restaurant with her gang of crazy 88s. It's the Yakuza, or the Asian mafia that she leads. Now, to anybody else, this is just another trademark Quentin Tarantino scene. The music is playing as people are walking, so you know something's going down. But for me, it was different. You see, for me, it was the first time that I saw an American-produced film that showed Asians as cool, confident, and sexy. And I thought, if Hollywood is this bad, well, the music industry is worse. There's like over 17 million Asian Americans in this country. And at that point, we were not really featured in Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, Spin Magazine, or MTV, at least back when they used to play music videos. I knew that something needed to change. And so that night, in the middle of the film, an idea for an Asian American band was born. But here's the thing. If you want to start a band, well, you got to have a name. So I started asking my friends in America's whitest major city, hey, what's something you think all Asian people have in common? And again, they would say, slanted eyes. Of course, I'm like, slanted eyes? Like, first of all, it ain't true. Not all Asian people have slanted eyes. And second, we're not the only people on the planet with any kind of slant to our eyes. But I grew up hearing that stereotype too. So I thought, what if we could change it? Because as a kid who was bullied, I always associated my eyes with shame, embarrassment, and fear. But what if we could flip it around from embarrassment to empowerment? What if we could change the story and what we associated with the term? And so that's when the idea for the Slants is born. Now, never in my life could I imagine what would come next. When we launched this thing, kids from all across the country started writing and sending us notes saying, thank you. Thank you for existing. Thank you for giving me a reason to be proud of my heritage. I mean, it was so incredible. We'd get these messages on myspace.com, which lets you know how far back this thing actually goes. But it made me realize that whether we liked it or not, we were going to be judged on behalf of our community. So we needed to step up our game. We started taking some of those experiences that we had growing up and turning them into song. Bullies used to come up to me saying things like Chinese, Japanese, dirty knees, look at these. We thought, hey, why not take it, flip it upside down and turn it into an anthem of pride instead? That's when the idea for the song Sakura Sakura was born.
We sing for the Japanese and the Chinese and all the dirty knees. Can you see me? We sing in harmony. We sing for the Japanese and the Chinese and all the dirty knees. Can you see me? We sing in harmony.
It was such an incredible time. I never forgot the first time we were on NPR's All Things Considered. You see, they spoke of this Asian American band that was touring and turning stereotypes upside down, all while building a geek army. They called it a geek army because we were playing anime conventions between all of our rock and roll gigs back then. And now we're doing events for organizations like the First Amendment Museum. So it's a different kind of geek army. But as we're making all these headlines and getting radio play, I realized it's this lifelong dream that was finally started to come true. But everything actually started falling apart, as it oftentimes will, when I met an attorney. Now, Spencer's this IP attorney in Portland, Oregon, and he's still a good friend of mine to this day. Now, one day he asked me, have you ever thought about applying to register for your band's trademark? And I'm like, It sounds kind of expensive, Spencer, but he says, no. It's only a few $100 and it'll be over in like 6 months after we apply. But he assures me it's really important because, bands need registered trademarks to be able to get record label deals and cut licensing agreements and that sort of thing. And I was like, well, I guess it's worth a shot. So let's go ahead and send in an application. After a few months, he calls me up and he says, hey, Simon, we got a problem. The trademark office has an issue with the name of your band. They said the name of your band is disparaging to persons of Asian descent. And I'm like, wait, does disparaging mean what I think it means? Are they saying we're racist to Asian people? And he says, yeah. I'm like, I didn't even know there was a law against this. I mean, there's all kinds of offensive stuff out there. Like, what does the law actually say? And so that's when he begins to read me what's known as Section 2A of the Lanham Act, which says you can't register a trademark if it's considered scandalous, immoral, or disparaging. But here's the thing. It's not just what anyone considers to be disparaging. They have to find what's called a substantial composite of the reference group. So in this case, a lot of Asian people have to be upset at us for us to actually be denied this right. So I'm like, we just toured nonstop for the last couple of years and played some of the biggest Asian American festivals in this country. And we've been doing outreach to our community for important causes, sometimes on behalf of the government. Who did they find who was offended by our name? And that's when he says, nobody. What do you mean nobody? I mean, you just said there had to be like a substantial composite. Nobody isn't like any composite. He says, nobody. But they did quote urbandictionary.com, and they used photos of Miley Cyrus pulling her eyes back in the slant-eye gesture. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And he says, no, I'm looking at Miley Cyrus right now. It's pretty offensive. And I'm like, I know the picture. I mean, Twitter was already upon that thing, but you're telling me that the federal government, with all of its power, is using sources that are not even acceptable in a junior high classroom to deny me rights. And he says, yeah, but I think they're wrong. I think if we could just appeal and show them how your community is supporting you, challenge them on their evidence, then we can change their mind on this. We can, and we absolutely should fight back.
Don't let the words this way, don't let the text prevail, don't let the weakness of others infect your health. Don't be their alibi, don't feed that greedy mouth. If it's time, then it's now. Stand up tall and fight back, rather than just sit back. Claw your way through the feedback. Don't get caught in that, don't get caught in that. Just react, heart and mind remain intact. To the no will not retract. Lead the pack, cause it's your time now, it's your time now.
So how do you prove that you're not offensive to yourself? I mean, think about it. What would you do? In our situation, we actually turned to our community. We had these executive directors of numerous nonprofit organizations from across the country who rose up and write letters in our support. We got dictionary experts, including one of the top linguistics experts in this country, who wrote this huge report over the history of the term slant. He showed that even in the heights of the 1930s and 40s, in terms of the usage of this word, it wasn't considered all that offensive, but how more often than not, especially in the recent decades, Asian Americans were actually reappropriating the term to use it in this self-empowering kind of way. And we even submitted an independent national survey that showed that over 90% of Asian Americans supported the use of our band's name. It was actually the most comprehensive survey and the largest appeal in U.S. history when it came to this law. But shortly after we submitted our appeal with thousands and thousands of pages of evidence, the government wrote back and said it's not good enough. It's not good enough because Urban Dictionary says so. They also use this British dictionary from the 1920s, not even an American dictionary, but one from over 100 years ago that described it as a slur. And so basically with a few keystrokes and a handful of abstract references, they wiped away the voices of my community. They said our effort was, quote, laudable, but not influential. You see, for them, it was more convenient to them to dismiss our evidence rather than to actually confront it. And on top of that, my attorney, Spencer, says, I've been working on this case for a few years now, and I'm actually burnt out on law. So you're going to have to find someone else to take it on. I did a quick Google search. I found this guy who wrote a blog about us, and he seemed to be pretty smart. So I called him up, and he decided to take the case up pro bono. But he says, as long as you fight like this, you're not going to win. Here's the thing about the law. It's been around for about 70 years, and nobody has ever won on appeal on a rejection of this kind. I mean, think about it. The government's basically saying, if we get this thing wrong, you can always appeal. But what they don't tell you is that you can never win. So we decided to change the conversation altogether. Like, instead of asking if we were offensive, we started asking why. Why do you think this band is offensive? Because, if slant is this inherent racial slur that they claimed, like, how come they gave it to everybody else? There had been over 800 applications for the word slant at the trademark office, but only one person in all of U.S. history has ever been denied a trademark registration under that law. And that person is me. So I was like, why is that? How come Slant Shack, Slanted Screen, Slanted Records, and everything else was okay, but when it came to the slants, it was not? Well, the government came back and they said, it's because you are just too Asian. Their exact words were, the evidence is uncontested that the applicant is a founding member of the band that is self-described and being composed of members of Asian descent. Thus, the association of the term the slants with those of Asian descent is evidenced by how the applicant uses the mark as the name of an all Asian American band. In other words, they're like, if you go to the slants.com, there's photos of Asian people all over it. And of course, I'm like, yeah, that's my face. Those are the faces of my band members. But from their perspective, they truly believe that you could not help associate the word slant with this obscure racial slur when you see a band like that. And because we use Asian imagery in our artwork, things like dragons, pagodas, and artwork from our cultural heritage, it just made us way too Asian. And so we appealed, saying, hey, you can't use somebody's race against them. That's not right. Not to mention that they still did not have any actual evidence of any Asian people being offended by this. They were only using internet memes and dictionaries from the late 1800s and joke websites. They didn't speak to a single Asian American organization about the issue. So we appeal all this, and we actually lose every single appeal until we get to the federal circuit, just one step below the Supreme Court. At the last minute, one of my attorneys throws in this argument saying, well, maybe the trademark office was actually violating our freedom of speech, that they maybe were abridging our First Amendment rights. And that court agreed with us. 9 out of 12 federal judges struck the law down as unconstitutional. After about 6 years, we finally got some dignity out of the process, where every single other legal argument failed, especially when we had substantial legal evidence. The First Amendment was able to prevail. And that's when I started to think, and when I started to learn that you can't solve systemic issues by only addressing the symptoms. Programs and surface level, like case-by-case ways of addressing problems are never going to be enough. We have to move upstream. And we have to think more strategically in order to get at the roots. Desmond Tutu once said that at some point, you got to stop pulling people out of the river and go upstream to figure out why they're falling in to begin with. When the law is failing, sometimes you have to use those more upstream arguments, like arguments around civil liberties, to change the actual system. And even after we won at the federal circuit, months passed, and the trademark office, well, they actually refused to do anything with us. It turned out that they were now BFFs with the Department of Justice, who decided to file suit and take me to the Supreme Court, the final boss stage of this whole legal adventure. Now, all along as we're appealing and we're spending years and years on this legal case, we kept trying to argue that it should be our communities that decided what's right for ourselves, not somebody who has no connection with it whatsoever in the government. There's all these things that I wanted to say that were based on principle, but principles and ethics don't always make very good legal arguments. Still, they mattered to me. For example, I was like, if the Supreme Court is making decisions of what's offensive to Asian people, well, some Asian people better be up in there. I wanted them to be able to look at me in the eyes and say that they knew better than us what was good for our community. And so that's why we crowdfunded our way there. You know, at the end of the day, it might seem like that we artists don't have a lot of power, but we can use the power that we do have and make it count. And so for us, that's about the music. So we decided to release an album calling it The Band Who Must Not Be Named. And we dedicated that album to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. We kicked it off with a song called From the Heart, which is really like our open letter to not only the trademark office, but to anybody else who did not believe in the power of reappropriation. You know, I said this many times before in my life, and I'll say it again. There is power in claiming an identity. You see, our identity is from the heart. And expressing that identity, well, that is a human right.
Sorry if we try too hard to take some power back for ours. The language of oppression will lose to education until the words can hurt us again. Sorry if you take offense, but silence will not make amends. The system's all wrong and it won't be long before the kids are singing our songs. There's no room for your backwards feelings and back out dealings. We're never gonna settle, never gonna settle. And no, we won't remain silent, no. It's a defining moment. We sing from the heart. Yeah, we sing from the heart. And no, we won't be complacent, no. It's a rock and roll nation. We sing from the heart. Yeah, we sing from the heart.
So, much to the chagrin of my attorneys, we actually did play the song and a few others on the steps of the Supreme Court. But it was a federal holiday, so they actually bend the rules a little bit on days like that. You see, we released our album just a few days before oral arguments at the court, right on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. That day was when we walked up the steps of the court. We looked out at Capitol Hill and we sang from our hearts. We also decided to celebrate the legacy of Dr. King by going to the MLK Memorial. We brought our guitars and we gathered with other people there in song and in spirit. But while I was there, I decided to take some time out for myself. You see, the legal fight had already spanned over 8 years at this point. And now I was actually the only original member of the band left. You know, some left because they got girlfriends, some left because the idea of spending a decade in a major legal battle wasn't what they envisioned for a music career. One by one, they started moving on, and I kept going. And while the new band members were supportive of this bigger effort, they just didn't have the same kind of memories at the beginning when we were like this super scrappy punk kids, just filled with hope and not bogged down by the legal system. So I wanted that time to myself to meditate and reflect on the words of Dr. King that were carved into stone all around us. Eventually, my eyes found my favorite quote of all, which says, "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I remember thinking, well, that's true, you know, but that moral arc, it doesn't bend on its own. It requires patience, it requires persistence, but most important, it requires people who are willing to step up and fight, no matter how long it might take, how much it might cost. That's how we bend that moral arc of the universe just a little bit more. That was the second big lesson in all of this. Justice is not a singular event. It is not a single victory. It is a process. It is constantly moving. It is constantly evolving with the culture, and it requires constant vigilance and engagement. The next morning, we wake up and we take a ride to the Supreme Court. I'll never forget, as we step out of the car, we're looking at this building. I mean, it's got these huge Roman columns on it, like it's going to be preparing for gladiator-like combat or something. At the top, 4 words are inscribed into it. It says, equal justice under law. And I remember looking at those words and thinking, I hope that's true today. I hope that's true, because almost every other time my community came before this government and this court, well, we didn't get anything that looked like justice, because it was the same governing body that said it would be okay to ban people from China, treating us like rodents that were infecting the population. It was like the same governing body that said it'd be okay to lock up American citizens of Japanese descent and put them into concentration camps, all in the name of safety. So I didn't have a whole lot of faith in this system, but it didn't really matter because we got ushered in. We were eventually seated in the courtroom, but turns out we're not sitting anywhere near my attorneys. I mean, they're up front, arguing from these tables, and right below the raised dais where the justices are going to be sitting. Now, behind those tables are rows and rows of padded chairs, like those are reserved for the members of the court or the attorneys who paid extra for the good seats. But behind them are rows and rows of hard wooden pews. There, in the second row, in the center of those pews, that's where we were seated. As the crowd starts pouring in, they see these 4 Asian dudes up in front in suits, and you could feel the fingers being pointed. You could hear the whispering and people saying, that must be the band. Eventually, someone waves the court marshal on over and they say, hey, this is Mr. Tam of the case being argued before the court today. From the Slants. Like, doesn't he at least get to sit in the front row of this section? The court marshal says, I got to check with the solicitor general. But I'm like, dude, that's the guy we're arguing against today. But 10 minutes later, the court marshal comes back and he says, I'm sorry, Mr. Tam, but we're saving the seat in case someone important shows up today. And I'm like, yo, why do you gotta cut so deep like that? But that's how I felt this entire journey anyway. It didn't really matter though, because once that gavel strikes and the invocation is made, the men and women in black robes begin coming in. And at that point, my eyes and ears are just fixated entirely on what's happening before me. Now, a lot of people ask me, what's it like being in the Supreme Court with your name on the docket? And I say, it's really weird. Like, you got all these Supreme Court justices, you have these high-ranking government attorneys all using my name and the name of my band, but they're talking about someone who's creating harm in this country, someone who's hurting their community, someone who's actually propagating anti-Asian racism. And I just think, you don't know me, you don't know our band. Like, you weren't there when we decided to work on all those anti-bullying campaigns. You probably didn't know that we use all the profits from our second album to fund research into why Asian American women experience cancer rates 8 times higher than any other demographic group. And you weren't there as I was talking to each of those kids, talking them out of taking their own lives, telling them that things would get better. I was like, you don't know me. You don't deserve to have the name of my band in your mouth. But I can't say anything at all. The irony of this whole situation is that I am in America's highest court fighting for freedom of expression. But in that room, I can't say a damn thing. So how does it feel? Invisible, insignificant. But about halfway through the arguments, there's this little voice that just breaks through everything. It's Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She asks the government, does it not matter that everybody knows the Slants are Asian? They're not using the word to disparage, but to describe and to remove the sting from the term. And I remember saying, I think I'm in love with the Supreme Court Justice, notorious RBG. She gets it. She's throwing it down. And the only thing the government could say in response is, well, we found a lot of articles on the internet that suggested otherwise. And I wanted to get up and say, no, you're talking about urbandictionary.com, son. You're not talking about my community. But of course, I can't say anything at all. 55 minutes, that's all it is. And then it's all over. After oral arguments, we're grabbing our stuff out of these lockers. And I'm thinking, I don't know if they really get it. And as we walk out the front doors of the building, past those giant columns and towards the steps, I noticed that the plaza outside is actually completely filled with people, like maybe a couple hundred folks down there. I'm like, what are they all doing down here? Court's in session. There's no tours today. They don't get it, do they? But as we're walking out, we're about halfway down those steps when the crowd looks up and they see us. And then they begin erupting in applause, cheering for us as we walk down. I'm like, I don't understand what's really happening. But as we hit those final steps, these two Asian kids run up to me. Simon, our parents led us to school to be here today. I'm like, what kind of Asian parents do you have? And they're like, no. You don't get it. We're from California. We're freshmen in high school. You see, for our whole lives, we heard about you. We heard about the one who's willing to stand up and fight for the dignity of our community, for us to decide what's best for ourselves. We just wanted to come in there and support you. We waited all night on that cold sidewalk, but there were just too many people. But we wanted to meet you to let you know that when we graduate, we're going to study public policy development in college. And when we finish there, we're going to run for office and we're going to change the system that you've been fighting against for so long. And I remember thinking, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I win or lose in that courtroom, because we won where it actually matters the most. And the hearts and the minds of the people who are most affected by the laws. It's about the long game. It's about changing systems and transforming the culture, because culture is upstream of policy. And, that's that day I learned another really important lesson about that work, that at the end of the day, it's about giving dignity to other people. Extending dignity to other people comes at no cost. We don't lose out, but it does require us to rethink how we approach our systems and how we reinforce norms that might not be producing the kinds of outcomes that we would actually consider just. You see, our systems are not actually broken. I mean, that's not what systems are. Systems work exactly as they're designed. So if they're not producing just results, say if the outcomes are inequitable, that means they require transformation so that they perform or provide better outcomes. As we walk out, join our attorneys at the edge of this courtyard where there's this media circus that had gathered with all their cameras and all their microphones and that sort of thing. There's all these reporters from all around the world that are waiting for a statement from my attorneys. But, I chose this small law firm out of Hackensack, New Jersey. It was actually their first time at the Supreme Court. We caught them taking selfies up in there. So they didn't actually prepare a statement. But they look over at me and they're like, well, Simon, do you want to say something? And I'm like, absolutely. Because I wanted to say all that stuff that no one mentioned in the class, right, in the courtroom, all the stuff that was on my heart, all the stuff that was pent up. But I could only make and express those kinds of arguments in my dreams leading up to this thing. So I walked right up to those microphones and I said, if the government truly cared about fighting against racism while using the trademark office to do so, why didn't they begin by canceling the trademarks for the KKK or Stormfront or actual white supremacist groups? Why did they choose to wage this battle against an anti-racist band? Maybe it's because they didn't actually care. Maybe it's because they want to use so-called bad language as a distraction from bad policy. You see, we were actually not the only people who were too Asian or the only people who wanted to reclaim our identities. Think about it. Who are the kinds of people that reappropriate language? It's mostly women, members of the LGBTQ community, and people of color. We understanding how empowering it is by taking these stigmatizing labels, flipping them upside down and saying to our oppressors that you don't get to define me. Only I get to do that. But it turns out that it actually made us targets under the law, because the majority of people who were ruled against when it came to this law were people who were trying to reappropriate these words and trying to use them for more just purposes. And when I decided to shine a light on this, the government didn't like that kind of attention, so they tried to put me into ruin as a result. That's why they sued me. But we just kept fighting and fighting until it actually brought us before the High Court. 6 months later, and it's decision day, June 19th. Juneteenth of all days. I'm totally asleep and my phone is just going nuts. It's 6 a.m. and I have over 700 missed notifications. So I'm like, I guess something happened. I hop on Twitter and I see that Oregon Public Broadcasting, the same NPR affiliate that broke the story of the Asian American band that was flipping stereotypes upside down, well, they sum it up in a single tweet. The Supreme Court rules in favor of the Slants. And later that day, I found out that decision was unanimous. You know, June 19th, Juneteenth, that was the day that this part of my legal journey ended. But although that destination was reached, it didn't mean it was over. So what actually happens after you win a major Supreme Court case? Well, in less than 2 years, our band actually decided to retire from live touring as a band. I mean, I was just tired. The miles, they wore us down. But I realized that all along, music was just a vehicle for the story. The bigger story, the one that I wanted to tell, was actually about expression, about identity, the importance of expression. And so we started the Slants Foundation, a nonprofit that would help provide mentoring and funding to artists of color who want to incorporate activism and civic engagement into their work. You know, other future troublemakers of this world. And so maybe that was actually the best thing about starting the Slants, that we could help create this community and empower another generation. And I think in that way, that's how the band plays on.
Bring on the comets, rain them down up from the stars. Light up the night sky, sing until the dawn is ours. Our wills what defines us, our failures remind us. This vow is calling loud and clear. Our songs and our stories, our memoirs of glory. The future is here, and the band plays on, even when hope is gone. You were my favorite song, and the band plays on, even when hope is gone. You were my favorite song, and the band plays on, and the band plays on.
Thank you so much for having us and joining us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. A lot of firsts tonight for our speaker series. First time we've ever had music. So, Simon, I don't think we're going to have music for a long time after this. So you may be the first and only one of our speakers that brings music to this. We had poetry once, not music.
You got some more musicians up in here.
Yeah, absolutely. So Simon, I want to get right into it with some questions. And I want to start off with a really honest question that I have. A very frank and question. So I do, a lot of the tours of the First Amendment Museum. I work with a lot of the school groups. People come into your exhibit all the time. It's one of the things you see right when you walk in, you see your exhibit. So I often hear people say, I don't know if I agree with Simon. I don't know if he did the right thing. I think overturning the Lanham Act is just going to empower racists. And I've heard the terms questionable and suspect and iffy motives to describe this overturning of the disparagement clause. What would you say to those people? And this is selfish because I need to get better at what I'm going to say to them. So what would you say to them?
I think that if the intention of the law was to stop people from using offensive language, it was already failed long before I came along, because there was plenty of stuff. It wasn't actually stopping anyone from using offensive marks. And at the end of the day, that's the importance of the First Amendment and freedom of speech, is that we have to be able to protect the opinions of others, because the reality is that as folks of color, our biggest battles are not against people using like certain slurs. I mean, any word at that point can be used in a disparaging manner and to create offense. our biggest battles are against like systemic forms of oppression where we don't have a level playing field. And if you're able to protect the civil liberties for all folks, then all of a sudden we now have the ability to do things like define ourselves, to express ourselves without worry that somebody might misunderstand or take those words out of context, like happened to me, and use that in an empowering way. There's a lot of folks who don't really quite understand the power of reappropriation, but what's fascinating is like, if you look at every empirical study that's ever done on it, including one that was done in 2017 by Washington University at St. Louis, they found that reappropriation actually tames political discourse, that it allows people to engage in a more productive manner, because all of a sudden, the folks who traditionally use offensive language kind of have to check in with other people and almost ask permission, like, oh, can I really sing along to every word of that Kendrick Lamar song? Or is it okay if I say this word? And it gives a different kind of power to those who actually sees it. I think it also speaks to this notion that power isn't given, it's taken. And for us as individuals who come from communities that are traditionally marginalized, we don't want to give that power to somebody else outside of our group. You don't want somebody else who has all the resources and all the power of the government making those decisions for us, because they oftentimes get those decisions wrong.
Yeah, so we have this conversation going on very much in the zeitgeist today about hate speech. What do we do about hate speech? In fact, I was listening to a podcast today where there was a lawyer who worked for a former president who said one of the exceptions to the First Amendment is you can't say hate speech. And I maybe want to tear my hair out, because I have someone who's a much higher place in the society, making a lot more money than me, saying something that's like, oh my gosh, like that's such a basic error 101. But I think there is this notion that hate speech is illegal because it's so bad, or at least it should be. So how do we counter hate speech as a society? Some might even say the First Amendment enables hate speech. And some might even go further and say it promotes it. So what do we say to these claims? How do we battle hate speech in a country with such strong laissez-faire notions on free speech like the U.S. has with the First Amendment?
Well, I think first of all, we should understand that there actually isn't a legal definition for hate speech. Like, what does it mean? Speech that is filled with hate? Like, any kind of word or phrase can actually be filled with like antagonism or feelings of aggression or negativity. And so because there's no working definition, since words can actually change meaning based on intention and context, it makes it very, very difficult to craft a law around it that, and especially a law that doesn't actually end up suppressing the rights of other folks. So that's really important to like understand from like a ground level to be able to have a fair conversation around it. The other thing that I would oftentimes encourage people to think about is like, what would it actually take? Like, I think if you censor people, it doesn't actually improve the situation. If you say, I don't like what you have to say, I don't like your beliefs, I don't like what your perspective, it doesn't actually engage them. It doesn't change their hearts and minds. And in fact, what it actually does is it oftentimes makes people even more antagonistic and dig down even deeper in their beliefs. The power of the First Amendment is in its ability for us to actually engage with one another and actually have civil discourse and to be able to have disagreements without worry that something like the government is going to end up taking over and suppressing our rights as a result. I think people also, another general misunderstanding about the First Amendment is people think like freedom of expression just means you get to say whatever you want, and that it kind of is a rule about people and companies and workplaces and all that. No, it's to protect us from government oppression. It actually entails a lot more than that. But the reason why we need to be able to express ourselves is because it is an important vehicle for creating social change. And so, hate speech, so to speak, has to be properly defined. Like, what do we actually mean by it? If it means like someone's saying something mean to us, well, is that really where we want to draw the lines? Is that worth like a fine or imprisonment? Because we probably all have said things that are mean or taken out of context when we don't actually mean those things. And we need to be able to have a better way of moving forward, of engaging as a society.
So I have a comment here. Thank you, Carl Little. It says, there's power in claiming an identity. That's a major theme of a new documentary, Fighting Indians, about the fight to remove the mascot at the Skowhegan High School. So Simon, Skowhegan High School is a high school here in Maine that I guess had I'm not familiar, but I guess they had a Indian of sorts as the mascot. And in your book, which if you want to take a moment to plug the book as well, there is a book Simon has. And in the book, you talk about the Native American community response to this. And there's this sort of side story about the Washington Redskins trademark. Could you talk a little bit about that? Talk about some of the responses you got from the Native American community and how you sort of worked through that?
Sure. So one of the really, really big worries as my case was going up before the High Court was people were afraid that if we won, then that meant the Washington football team would win and that they would never change their name from like this offensive slur that was oftentimes used against Native Americans. And, there were some very, very vocal activists, both within Native and Indigenous communities, as well as allies, like, other folks who were just like, hey, this is going to be opening up a floodgate of all kinds of terrible things being said. And I decided to kind of engage with them directly, rather than just shutting them out. I met with those activists, I met with different people, and I was like, let's have a conversation about this. Like, what does it actually mean? What does justice mean to you? And shared my own experiences and my own story about how the government was using my racial identity against me. And, and I was like, I've actually been a supporter of the Change the Mascot campaign for several years. Just because I differed in terms of my tactics on how to go about it didn't mean like my values were any different. And once we actually had a chance to engage and to connect with one another, many of them started realizing, oh, we can have a more nuanced approach to this sort of thing. And I mean, again, that just speaks to the power of things, of expression, and why protecting expression is so important. And they started realizing, well, maybe if we leverage our First Amendment rights, maybe we can create change and by shifting what some of those tactics ought to be. And so obviously the Washington football team changed its name, right? Like they're now the Washington Commanders, and many other sports teams, pro sports, college, high school levels, all started changing their mascots as well. Here in Ohio, we used to have the Cleveland Indians. Now they're the Cleveland Guardians, and so on. And it just showed that we didn't need to use something like a massive hammer, like the weight of the government, by like trying to get the government to compel people to change like how they use a mascot for a pro sports team, but we instead put the conversation in the communities themselves and use the marketplace of ideas and the actual commercial marketplace. That kind of change that begins in hearts and minds, it actually sticks and it stays. And so it's far more effective in engaging in that kind of way. And what's interesting is, like, I was thinking about this the other day, that when you look up articles about me and the band and our case, like everything like up through 2017 and maybe in 2018, every single article written about our case referenced the Washington football team. You can find a single one that didn't talk about pro football in any kind of way. But when you look at the articles that have been published in the last few years, none of them talk about it. And it was like, oh, they ended up changing their name. Simon was right after all. And it was like they pretended nothing happened, which is really fascinating to me, because I had to endure all kinds of like lingering consequences as a result of people like saying those things. But, I think it just goes to show that like sometimes we can get so attached to our version of like like what is ethical, that we forget what is legal is also a very, very important conversation to have too. Because the moment we start carving out these little exceptions of, like, well, this type of speech, like, a lot of people are like, well, I could see why reappropriation was okay. Like, yeah, clearly an Asian band calling themselves the Slants is okay. But if a white supremacist group wants to use the word, that's not okay. It gets really dodgy because now you have government interference and thinking about things like what our actual intentions are behind speech. And that can create all kinds of other problems. And especially when you have people making those decisions who don't have expertise in like linguistics and identities of people who are involved in all these kind of debates about what is right or what isn't right.
And what was the response during this whole ordeal from the members of the Asian American community? Were people mostly supportive? Was there any pushback, mix, or what was the situation there?
Yeah, so the overwhelming majority of our community was really supportive of our effort. And I mean, there's no doubt that we would probably not have been able to win without their support. I mean, there was over 100 organizations involved with that effort, writing letters of support and signing on to briefs from organizations like the ACLU or Cato Institute and sharing their perspective. So they were really, just deeply and gratitude of their support. But, there were other groups as well, like the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, who were concerned that if we won, that it would open up this can of worms, this Pandora's box of like really hateful, awful things being registered as trademarks. And they actually filed a brief against me. And what's fascinating is like, as we started touring the country and sharing our story, almost all those organizations were like, you know what, we were wrong about this. In fact, the author of the guy who wrote the legal brief against me by that very organization attended an event we did in Atlanta. And he's like, I've never been so wrong about something in all my life. Like I would, if I could go back, I would undo everything I said about you. And, because, they were writing things like Mr. Tam cannot wield his First Amendment rights like a sword, compelling everyone to like bow down to his beliefs and trying to make profit out of it. And as a result, people claimed that I was extorting communities and using principles of diversity and inclusion to enrich myself in the process, and all these like pretty awful things. I just this week I found 2 books that were published during that time period who said really just horrible things about me and our band. And it just shows that like not everyone's going to be this monolithic group, that these conversations have to be ongoing. And that's kind of why earlier I mentioned that justice isn't a singular event. It's not a result. It's an ongoing battle that we have to be persistent in. I kind of compare it with health. Like you don't just go to the gym one day or like you don't stop eating McDonald's for 10 days in a row and you're like, I'm healthy now. No, you're healthy because you're constantly engaged in healthy habits of diet and exercise. And when it comes to things like justice in this country, we have to be constantly engaged. We have to be constantly vigilant and participating in civics and local town halls and voting, because society is constantly moving, policy is constantly shifting, and we have to be staying up to, keeping up with everything that's happening and making sure that, the government is doing what it's supposed to be doing and that it's actually serving the very people that we intended to serve.
Yeah, this conversation, and I feel like with a lot of these issues, brings out my inner history nerd, and I always think of the Thomas Jefferson quote, "Tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." We have to have these things ongoing all the time. When we look at history, we think of it as a lot of these issues are sort of solved in the past. We've got our answers, here we go. But with each generation and every new era, every new decade, as the passing of time, we have to redo a lot of these conversations, or we have to remind people about a lot of this stuff. So I want to have a quote or a question here from Susan Gross. Would you please say more about your nonprofit empowering the next generation? Specific examples would be great. And then a follow-up question from Carl Little. Carl, thank you for the question. I wonder what would happen if your case came up in front of the current court.
Sure. So our nonprofit, the Slants Foundation, is something that both Joe and I serve on, along with this incredible board of directors. It's 100% volunteer driven, and we really like to focus on coaching and mentoring and funding artists who are working at that intersection of arts and activism. So in particular, like civic engagement work, but especially people who are using their art to speak to kind of timely and maybe sometimes controversial issues. I kind of mentioned this idea that we really believe that culture is upstream of policy, that you oftentimes have to be able to change hearts and minds because that's the kind of change that will eventually stick. And so we're doing all kinds of things. We helped launch a music business conference that was entirely composed of artists of color. We, in the midst of the pandemic, we provided support by issuing a bunch of grants to people who were creating works that told stories from the Asian American perspective, stories that encouraged civic dialogue and that kind of solicited empathy and compassion as we were seeing the rise against our community in the form of discrimination and violence. And this year, we actually funded 10 different artists to write songs about legislative issues that they're passionate about, and to have them work with a local organization, grassroots org, who's either advocating for some kind of law or some kind of change, and teaching them how they can work together. So the nonprofits they work with get a bit of coaching, free publicity, and kind of a lesson how to work with arts to advance their work and rethink civic engagement beyond just door knocking and petitions, and learn how to leverage things like music. And the musicians on the other side get to think more comprehensively about how to create a social impact beyond just playing the occasional charity gig or writing a song that they're passionate about. So both sides get to use data and community engagement as that piece. And we're actually recording all of this, not only the music, but interviews with them. And we'll be releasing a television show, a series that's debuting this upcoming May on it as well. So really, really fun work. We get to, fund and be part of films and theater shows and music. It's pretty extraordinary. It's what I like to do with most of my nights and weekends. In regards to the, case coming up, if it was before the current court, honestly, I don't really know. I mean, we could certainly speculate what different justices might, what their positions might be. There was a sister case that followed mine in 2018, In Re Brunetti, which had to do with a clothing company. Their trademark was FUCT, and people were afraid that, it could be read as a very offensive term. And so when that came before the court, you would think, because just the year prior, they ruled unanimously in my favor, that this is a slam dunk. This is the same provision of law, 2A of the Lanham Act, registering trademarks. But in that case, the court was split 7-2. So I'm not exactly sure. I think it can sometimes depend a little bit on the cultural context of what's happening in our society. But some legal experts believe that my case might be one of the last unanimous free speech cases in a very, very long time. We also only had 8 justices in our particular case, because right before we went to oral arguments, Scalia had passed. And even though Gorsuch was just being sworn in, it happened after our oral arguments. And so because he wasn't sitting on those arguments, he didn't have a say in terms of the actual decision as well. So I would suspect that they would probably be in favor of our case because, it had a lot of favorable set of facts. The overwhelming majority of law professors and federal judges and so on agreed with the ruling in our case, but you never know these days. The best that we can do is just continue to advocate and making sure that whether it's my case or anyone else's case that's going before the court, that we do protect freedom of expression.
So I want to try to bring Joe, if you're listening to this, I want to try to bring Joe into this conversation and shift gears a little bit. What did your guys' family and friends, parents, grandparents, people close to you, girlfriends, wives, whatever, what do they think about this whole ordeal, and what do they think about what you guys are doing now? I don't think my parents would be pleased if I became a rock star that went to the Supreme Court.
I started this too old, so my mom was not happy, and I'm still doing the music thing somehow because Simon's always got some scheme up his sleeve. So my mom's not completely happy about it, but it was an opportunity. It was one of those things where, I definitely did not sign up. Like Simon said in his talk, I did not sign up to do this as a activist person to go to the Supreme Court. That was literally my second gig, was to go with Simon to the federal courts, and I was just like, that's not normal. I just wanted to play guitar and be in a band and tour, but once in a lifetime. So I think my mom can at least appreciate that, and my dad's happy that I get to play music, so I think it works out.
My parents are super worried about me throughout the whole ordeal. I think in particular when our legal case was kind of near its height, I mean, it was just taking so much out of me, financially, emotionally, mentally. I think they're just really, really worried about me. At one point, because my dad actually left China as a political refugee when he was very young. He was like, "Hey, Simon, if you cause too much trouble, the government, what if they put you in prison?" And I was like, "Dad, if they put me in prison, they're going to be in even more trouble." I was like, "That's not how it works here in the United States." And, maybe I was a little bit naive about certain things, but I firmly believe that if we just fought using the truth and by fighting on with our principles, that we would be victorious. Eventually, they came around and they were a little bit more supportive. Although I will say that when I got engaged to be married, they're like, "You gotta stop playing this band thing. Your wife's gonna leave you." I think she knows what she's getting into. So, I think these days they seem generally supportive. Sometimes worried, but they have no idea what I do for a living. So I guess it works out that way.
So, final question: what's the future for you guys, both of you? Any projects coming up? I know you kind of mentioned a couple of them, but anything you want to tell the audience about? Ways that they can get in touch, learn more, things they should be paying attention to, that sort of thing.
Sure. So Joe and I have actually co-written and composed an opera. It's debuting in like 3.5 weeks at the Opera Theater of St. Louis. So when we're not doing things like this, we're like kind of like in opera mode all the time. It's going to be a rock and roll opera. We're super excited about it. It just kind of takes this particular story and puts a lot of fantasy, comedy, and fun and a lot of heart into it. And of course, rock and roll. We just finished writing a brand new album, so that we'll be dropping that near the end of this year. And it features many of our favorite artists from around the country, other Asian American acts that we just truly respect and love. We're working on a musical theater show that's coming out this fall. That's debuting in Cincinnati. I don't know. There's probably something else. Joe, what am I missing stuff here?
Travel around the country and do more events. We're gonna have a little mini reunion with the original lead singer of the band in April. And it's kind of one of those things where there's fun for us because, again, we're getting up there in the ages as far as musicians go, but we still want to keep playing music wherever we can. But we also want to do what the foundation's trying to do, which is to give platform to other folks. So everything that we're doing too is if we're creating any kind of pieces of work, younger artists can come and either take over the roles or they can be inspired to make their own pieces of work. So going into opera is kind of one of those things where it's It's not the most fun, but guess what? If we can do it, hopefully somebody else can do it even better. So that's kind of our thing.
Yeah, just showing, like, helping redefine what's possible, I think is probably very, very exciting for us, because it's like we don't have to keep on doing some of this. We didn't even have to do the opera, but we're like, you know what? If it just opens the door a little bit for someone else and makes it easier for them, then awesome. If we can create roles for people who look like us in stages that normally don't have us, then that's fantastic. Like, so, hopefully it keeps us challenged and engaged in that kind of work.
Well, awesome. Simon and Joe, thank you guys so much for joining us. Just a reminder to everyone listening, this is going to be uploaded onto YouTube. It's going to be on the First Amendment Museum website tomorrow or next week. Keep your eye out for that. Please share it if you want to. Show it to your friends and family. Show it to your classrooms, whatever. Pay attention to our website and upcoming events. We have more speakers coming up. You can find our YouTube and again on our website, you can find our past speaker series events. So if you enjoyed tonight, we have so many like these with all sorts of different topics about the First Amendment and the 5 freedoms found within. And of course, we have our exhibition opening. So if anybody's in May, don't want to say anything about the date because I can't remember off the top of my head, but if you look at our website under events, you'll see the dates for our exhibit opening where Simon and Joe, are you making it up to Joe will be there. We have
We'll be playing music and sharing stories and having a great time.
Awesome. May 11th. Thank you, Christian. Fantastic. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. This was fantastic. And I wish you guys the best.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.